Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you here. We are having a great convention, and the talks and the sessions and the poster sessions have been amazing so far. And there's much more to come, including tomorrow. Tonight, the Bring the Family speaker is one of the foremost researchers on the many psychological phenomena pertinent to cultural diversity. Jennifer Richeson has used a broad range of empirical methods, from the examination of nonverbal behavior to the study of brain scans, to examine the potential cognitive costs, mutual misperceptions, and attitude shifts associated with intergroup interactions. A key finding of her work is that interactions between minority and majority group members impels heightened self-control to combat any appearance of prejudice, which requires increased cognitive efforts that make these interactions stressful and cognitively draining. She's perhaps best known for her work showing how actual and perceived increases in racial and ethnic diversity can yield both more egalitarian but also more exclusionary racial attitudes. Jennifer earned her PhD in social psychology at Harvard in 2000 and was a fellow of Stanford University's Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. She became an assistant professor of psychology at Dartmouth College in 2000 and moved 5 years later to Northwestern University, where she held appointments in the psychology and African American studies departments. And she was a faculty fellow of the Institute for Policy Research and the Center on Social Disparities and Health. In 2006, she was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant and was named a Guggenheim Fellow in 2015. And in 2016, she left Northwestern for Yale University, where she is the Philip R. Allen Professor of Psychology and Director of the Social Perception and Communication Lab. Jennifer is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and an APS Fellow, and a past member of the APS Board of Directors. You can learn all about Jennifer's life and career in an Inside the Psychologist Studio video on the APS website. I was there when it was recorded live. I highly recommend it. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Richeson.
Good evening. Oh, we can do better than that. Come on now. Good evening. Okay. All right. Who brought their family? So especially good evening to those of you who are joining us, family of psychologists. Suparna, thank you for that really thoughtful introduction and for inviting me to give this address, and thank you all for coming. APS is, of course, very near and dear to my heart. In fact, as a new graduate student and then new assistant professor, APS was my main conference, and it's nice to be able to come home regularly, so thank you. And thank you all for coming. So today, I really want to talk about this question that Suparna really alluded to is, what is the situation with diversity? How should we think about diversity, and what is it doing to us as individuals and us as a nation? Before that, though, I want to take some time at the beginning, because the end, things get messy, to really shout out the real heroes of this work, my collaborators, Maureen Craig, who was a former PhD student with me, who's now an assistant professor at NYU, and then my current doctoral students, Julian Rucker and Zanny Brown, who have really done the heavy lifting of this work. So you might have heard that the United States, like many nations, is becoming increasingly diverse in terms of its racial and ethnic composition, and it's expected to continue doing so for some time. Indeed, many news reports have commented on, and some have expressed alarm about what's called a so-called majority-minority future, wherein racial minorities considered together are expected to become the numerical majority relative to white Americans in the United States. Sometimes it's by 2050, some reports 2042. It, of course, shifts based on policy, but this level of diversity is something that is expected in our country, and I should note in actually quite a few other countries. So diversity is happening. The question, though, is what should we expect to come from this level of diversity, or any type of diversity, any diversifying social context? And there are many narratives about diversity. Some are something like this: diversity is a beautiful thing. It is so. It changes who we are. It expands our horizons. Some offer this narrative, often companies: diversity is our advantage, right? It makes us unique. We can leverage the talents of different people, their experiences, to speak to a broader community. Okay? I'd also suggest, and both are true, right? They're evidence for each of these narratives. I think we also need to acknowledge, however, that diversity is challenging, and it's always been so. So consider a different type of diversifying social context. This one, the one we called integration. When it was on the backs of young kids, this is Ruby Bridges, integrating the New Orleans public schools, elementary schools. Or this young woman, Elizabeth Eckford, doing the same thing in Little Rock, high school. Or consider this person. This is my mom, Gloria. This photo was in 2012, but my mother was the first sort of generation, really cohort of students to integrate the Baltimore City Public Schools. She went to a high school named Eastern High School. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was predominantly all white until her cohort, plus a few others. And not too long ago, a few years ago, she went to her 56th high school reunion. And my mother doesn't talk about this much, but I said, Mom, this is all through text. She does text. I said, Mom, how was your 56th high school reunion? And this is what she said, or wrote. It is amazing how nice our white classmates treat us now. Most teachers and students harassed us every day back then. What a difference. At least a lot of them are nice to us during these festivities, right? It's still with her, 56 years later. Diversity is challenging. It's challenging for those doing the diversifying, but it's also challenging for these folks in the midst of a changing context, I would argue. And in part because it's challenging, diversity is and has always been challenged. Think about the efforts to diversify the public schools in Boston, right? We are not racist pigs. We are parents. Think about the recent events in Charlottesville, right? So I'd like to suggest that this is the diversity of, the paradox of diversity. It is happening, and it's valuable, and it's just, given the changing demographics of the nation, for our spaces, our schools, our courthouses, our universities, our workplaces to also diversify. However, it's challenging psychologically, and thus it is constantly challenged. Okay? So I want to spend the rest of the time just talking about one case study in this paradox, the approaching majority-minority United States. Okay? And this is the work that my students and I have been doing for some time now. I'm not sure how we got stuck here, but we did. And it's really trying to understand how Americans are responding to these projections that it became quite omnipresent of a majority-minority US. Okay, is that good? Talk about this data? I so can't hear you. Okay. I'm from a call and response culture. Talk about diversity. Let's play along. Okay, so I'm gonna say a little bit about its effects on racial attitudes, the work we've done, the research, ours and others, its effects on political ideology and public policy, and then spend some time, I hope, if there's time, to talk about the implications for racial equity in our current moment, in the 21st century. Okay, so so we're all on the same page. I know we're all from different subfields of psychology, and then also we got a lot of family here. So the general methodology of this work, I'm an experimental social psychologist, although that's not all the studies I'm going to present. And what we're doing is inviting largely US citizen white Americans, although some studies I'll present are with other types of participants, either into the lab or in an online recruitment, and we're manipulating what we call the salience or their consideration of this information about changing demographics in the United States. So either they're presented with an article like that one I presented from CNN, always veridical information about the projected changes in the nation. So maybe something like this. We'll call this the racial shift condition. So it looks something like this. It gives information about these projections. Again, it's always veridical, usually taken from the US Census at the time, with a nice headline that gets to the point. Okay, and we're going to compare reactions of participants who are in this condition, randomly assigned, to some type of control. Either a control in which race is salient, but where they're given the current demographics, okay? Or sometimes a race control where we're talking about the demographic shift, a very similar shift that's happening in a different European country, so not really relevant to their own situation as the dominant group in the, here in the United States, okay, but still making race salient. And sometimes a control that's race neutral, but it talks about a different shift in the country. So in this case, it's the people are moving geographically more than before. Sometimes with college students, it's that the growth in the aging population, again, another outgroup that's growing, but not a racial one. Okay, so we're comparing this racial shift to one of these conditions across studies, not in any one study. And then afterwards, we solicit responses on the relevant DVs, okay? So first, how does salient racial shift information affect racial attitudes, right? One might expect, as I think, and I've talked to the mostly guys who really run the race beat at the census, when they initially put out this information about shifting demographics, they really thought, like, isn't that interesting? That's so interesting for a country like the United States that we have this majority-minority situation. How cool. Some of us thought it might have a different effect. But of course, we're scientists, so we decided to do some studies to see. And study after study, we found something that looked like this. And this is just one example on a very straightforward, explicit self-report measure of how much, again, remember these are white American participants, how much do you enjoy affiliating, spending time with in social settings, members of your own racial group? And we found time and time again, those in the control, so the current racial group, right, current racial demographics, the control condition, expressing less desire for homophily, racial homophily, or wanting to be with other whites, than those in the US racial shift condition, okay? We found this on several other explicit self-report measures of racial attitudes. We found something similar on the quite popular implicit association test, or more automatic associations. In these two sets of studies, we brought in samples, again, of white American college students, and we asked them, after either the racial shift information or some control information, we asked them to how quickly they could associate white with good, and either, in one sample, Black with good or bad, or Asian American with good or bad, right? And we're expecting to see whether or not there's a difference in the automatic sort of pro-white bias vis-a-vis one or the other of these other racial groups as a function of making this information salient about the racial shift. Now note, so African Americans are not growing at all in share of the population. right? And Asian Americans are growing, but obviously are also a very small proportion of the population. So we thought, will we see it on vis-a-vis these groups when they're not really contributing the same way, right, to the growing numbers of racial minorities as Latinos are? And of course, this we found in both instances, a pro-white bias after reading about the US racial shift compared to the racial shift, a very similar one going on in the Netherlands. Okay, again, consistent with this idea that making the US racial shift salient increases the expression of racial bias. Okay, we found this across a number of other studies. I'm just presenting those two, but so have several other teams, both psychologists as well as political scientists, and both on explicit self-report measures and on implicit measures, more automatic measures. Okay, so the evidence for this is quite strong. It turns out making the US racial shift salient also increases the expression of negative attitudes about and toward other racial groups, anger toward racial minorities, and fear of racial minorities. And this has been found in when you make it salient for white Canadians, of course, talking about Canada's changes, and in the UK, and with Italians. Okay, so it's a broader phenomenon, this shifting, this sense of my group that is currently a majority seems to be losing its size, population. It also has been shown in other work to increase feelings of threat and anxiety among white Americans. And it increases support for assimilation as a policy and more active opposition to efforts, policies towards diversity that support diversity. Okay. So taken together, this work and ours, again, suggests that diversity can be psychologically challenging. And indeed, we, meaning social psychologists, should have known this. It's an entirely old literature that has shown that increasing population sizes of minority groups can increase the tension between groups. This is old school Gordon Allport, Bloomer, and even recently, Ryan Enos has shown this with just witnessing or being around people speaking Spanish on the train in Chicago increases anxiety and negative attitudes among white passengers. Okay? Robert Putnam has shown that diversity is often correlated with increased sense of social isolation in a neighborhood. And of course, classic work on social identity threat, Taj Fawn Turner, more recently Branscombe and colleagues, and of course, old school Bloomer suggests that indeed, when you experience your group as, or another group, an outgroup is growing, there's a sense of threat. And indeed, Bloomer told us in 1958 that this sense of changing, potential change of group position is the fuel for prejudice. So grad students, if you're in the room, just read the classics. So we really picked up on this idea of group status threat from Bloomer and tried to capture that idea, and I'll show you some studies later, but really at the heart is this question or the sense that if those outgroup members, increase in status, right, we are likely to lose our influence in society. Okay? And influence broadly, not just material things, although that matters too, but also, as captured nicely in this Atlantic article, this sort of cultural sense of normativity, right? So this nice piece, it talks about the gradual erosion of whiteness at this touchstone of what it means to be American, right? That sense of cultural normativity, that status is also at stake. This we call a cultural dominance threat. Dan Bowden-Huo called it prototypicality threat, but I can barely say that word, and definitely not more than once. But it's the sense that American society will change, right? What it means to be American will change, and whites will lose their status as prototypical. Okay, so even though these are related, I'm just gonna say for now that we know from our work and others that salient information about this racial shift increases group status threat and cultural dominance threat. Okay, and we also know from many studies that one or both of these seems to mediate the the effect of making that information salient, the demographic change, and each of these outcomes, and has been shown statistically and also causally for each of these, okay? So we started this work because literally this information was getting pumped in the media ad nauseum, and I'm remembering my Allport and my Bloomer thinking, no way this can be good for race relations, but let's collect some data. It turns out, though, while this information was becoming more and more, getting more attention, pundits also started talking about what these demographic changes might mean for politics, right? We heard something like this often, right? Obama's win shows demographic shifts working against Republicans, right? And they meant this sense that Obama was able to pull together these supermajorities of Black voters and Asian Americans and Latino voters and young people and women, and this is unbeatable, right? Demographics is destiny, we keep hearing. In fact, Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, said this in the paper. He said it, not me. The demographics race, we're losing badly. We're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term. All right, 2012, he said this. More recently, a number of books came out about the new political moment, Brown is the New White, or the end of white Christian America, talking about the surge in political power of racial minorities and the decline in political influence of white Christians. Right? I mean, you guys might be feeling threatened right now. Right? This is something, okay? But we know, these demographic shifts are not destiny. There's any number of ways to intervene literally in the demographics themselves and in their influence. We also know that this is predicated on the assumption that these constituencies will vote a certain way. Right? Which we also, that could change. And in fact, considerable research by John Jost and others has shown repeatedly that perceived threats, largely, threats of physical, to the physical self, but also societal instability, uncertainty, can lead people, or at least nudge them to supporting more conservative ideology. So we wondered whether or not this type of salient racial shift information might also shift people to endorse conservative ideology more strongly. So we tested it, okay? Does exposure to information about the changing US racial demographics influence political ideology and policy support? Just gonna talk about a couple of studies where we did this, okay? But of course we've done this in many. In this one, it was a convenient sample online of white Americans. We asked about their baseline political ideology, an easy self-report measure, and then we gave them, randomly assigned them to read about the US racial shift or the similar shift in the Netherlands. We then asked them a number of additional questions about that political ideology right after that manipulation. They all loaded together, but because they're slightly different scales, the results are normalized, okay? So what do we find? Does exposure to this racial shift seem to boost support for conservative ideology? Indeed, it does, okay? And it's not just self-reported ideology. You also find it on policy support, okay? Or support for the conservative position on a number of policies. Again, this was a nationally representative sample of white adults, but a very similar design, exposure to the racial shift information or control. And then we asked them about a number of policies. Some were decidedly race-related, some were more race-neutral. Turns out it doesn't matter. Again, these are normalized. So higher numbers mean more support for the conservative position on the policy. And you see that those in the control condition are less likely to support the conservative position than those in the racial shift condition. And it doesn't matter whether it's obviously race-related or not. Okay, you get the same effect. That is not always the case across all studies, but if you pull them together, that is almost always the case, okay? So is this due to perceived group status threat? Well, we looked at this a number of ways, right? We had this one item measure in that nationally representative sample I just told you about. So does the racial shift increase support for the endorsement of this idea, right? If they increase, we are in trouble. Yes, it does. And we know that the effect of the racial shift information, that manipulation, on conservative policy endorsement that I showed you before is statistically mediated by the extent to which the participants in the study said that they felt threatened, that their group felt threatened. Okay, you guys with me? All right, okay. But I done told you that I'm an experimental social psychologist, and those are just some stats. So we want to know, is there causal evidence of a role for group status threat, right, as opposed to just statistical evidence? So what we did was in a new sample of participants, we brought them in, either randomly assigned them to the racial shift condition, right, or a control. And then we had a third group that was randomly assigned to the racial shift condition, right? It looks something like this, just updated for the time. And they either they instead of just getting this alone, right, the same information as those in the racial shift condition, they also got just a little bit more information. This we call the assuaged threat condition, okay? And these participants also learned that despite the shift, the relative societal status of different racial groups is likely to remain steady, which we know is true. Right? We gave a lot of reasons why, but then said overall, despite the numerical shift, groups' relative positions in society are likely to remain the same, okay? Thinking this would reduce the threat that was activated in the 2 paragraphs that they had read before this one, okay? Right, about changing demographics. In this study, we replicated each of our previous studies where we found that participants in that control condition, right, tended to support the conservative positions on these policies less than those all the way to your right in the basic racial shift condition, right? We're now calling it status threat because we know that's the mechanism. But the question is, what happens if we assuage this threat? That support is gone, okay? And we've replicated this a number of times now, okay? You also see the same elimination of the effect on self-reported political ideology, okay? Right, so status threat that seems to be triggered by salience of the shifting racial demographics of the nation seems to be leading to endorsements of political ideology, conservative political ideology more, policy support more, and this is something that we've shown time and time again, as have political scientists now, okay? But of course, again, I was talking about what's happening to members of the current majority, white Americans, as if they're the only people who are getting exposed to this information. So you might be wondering, well, what are other racial minorities doing? Are they like, yeah, our numbers are rising, or are they also affected, in a way that's like, well, I don't know what this means for me. So we decided to look and see, how are other racial minority groups reacting to this increasing racial diversity? So one clue for how it might affect at least certain racial minority groups is the fact that Hispanics, right, we know, Latinos, especially initially when these reports came out, was the group that's rising, increasing the most, right? So you might think that despite concern that all of these racial groups are going to become some kind of coalition, actually non-Hispanic racial minorities might respond quite similarly to white Americans. Like, well, wait a minute, what does this mean for my group? Might have their own sense of status threat. Okay. So does this growth in the Hispanic population also seem to activate a conservative shift among racial minorities, blacks and Latinos? It should, right, if the psychology is right. And indeed, there's evidence that it does. Right, again, this is an outgroup, a racial outgroup that's growing, that activates a sense of uncertainty. It's not quite the same status threat, we know from our work, but a similar type of concern about the group standing that leads to a little bit of shift. Again, these are racial minorities who are generally quite liberal, so the numbers are low, but you still see greater support for political conservatism, greater support for endorsement of conservative policies, not on the ones that affect their group, right, but on others. It's not due just to immigration, though, we've tested to see, right? And interestingly, even a bit of increased warmth toward to Republicans, right? So if you look at under the control condition, remember these are basically almost Black and Latino and Asian Americans, right? Exposed to control information or information about Hispanic growth. And in the control condition, you see what you'd expect, right? Greater warmth, higher numbers towards Democrats than Republicans. And while that's still true, you see that red bar is a little bit greater, higher, more warmth toward Republicans after being exposed to information about Hispanic numbers growing, right? Conservative shift, all right? So this is not the psychology of white people. It is the psychology of groups and relative position. And this shifting racial demographics of the United States, especially when articulated as Hispanic growth, but not exclusively, does seem to elicit conservative shift in racial minority groups as well, outgroups, okay? So what about Latinos? What about Hispanics? What do you think? What do they do when they hear about the shifting demographics? Any guesses? They celebrate. Do they become more conservative, more liberal, nothing? What do people think? Conservative? No. Actually, we have they seem to do nothing, go in either direction, right? There's no consistent evidence. Every now and then you see a trend towards actually more liberal politics and political ideology, but it's not stable. And if you think about it, right, I'll get to this later, Hispanic, like most of these groups, are made up labels. And so when you're looking at this from a Hispanic sample, they're like, well, is it literally my group or is it those other people? Right, just because we see these groups as actual collections doesn't mean people understand themselves that way. So the psychology is actually quite the same, where they're like, well, which groups are increasing? Is it my group or not? Right? Okay, so again, we found quite a strong evidence and consistent evidence that making this racial shift salient increases support for conservative policies and even self-endorsement of conservatism among white Americans and non-Latinos, racial minorities. Rob Willer and his group have shown it also increases support for the Tea Party, quite extreme or more right-wing part of the Republican Party among Republicans, conservatives, okay? So it's shifting Republicans to the right. And I should say this is important because in a lot of our work that's used either nationally representative samples or convenient samples, we're seeing this in liberals and moderates. And wow, that's surprising, it's liberals and moderates, but it's also, they have room to move, right? So it's easier to find this in white liberals and moderates, okay? So, this reports of the demise of the Republican Party, we know, was premature. But remember, we were doing this a long time ago, or not a long time, but certainly before our current moment. Our work was first published in 2014. And at that time, Tom Edsall in the New York Times wrote about this phenomenon in a column he called The Great White Hope. And he says, I'll just call this out, this part, 3 unlikely sources are providing qualified encouragement to Republicans who are either openly or covertly committed to a campaign strategy that focuses on white turnout, as opposed to seeking votes from Hispanics and African Americans. 2 of those 3 sources were our publications. I could have made a lot of money as a Republican strategist. But then I would not be here with you, good people. But we know somebody did use this strategy, in part, in 2016. And there's now quite a good bit of evidence that Trump supporters in particular, this is from the Republican primary in Massachusetts, but Republicans who were most likely to support Trump were also most likely to think that a majority-minority America was a bad thing. Okay? And more rigorous empirical work has now demonstrated that making the shifting demographics in the nation salient for whites, both white Democrats and Republicans, is associated with greater support, or at least intentions to vote for Trump. And there's some evidence, recent evidence from Diana Muntz, that not necessarily the salient shift, but the status threat that's associated with the salience of this racial shift did predict actually voting for Donald Trump. Okay? So why does this matter, right? We started doing this work, one, because we thought the communication of this demographic change in the way it was being communicated might lead to some problems. And we think we were right to be so concerned, but our concern is not, okay, well, maybe it's a little bit of a tick in this direction about negative racial attitudes, but because it has real implications for efforts towards racial equity in our current moment. Okay. So let me start here. This is I don't know if anyone here saw the National Geographic issue on race. It's actually extraordinary. I invite you to take a look at it. But one of the articles in it by the great Nichelle Norris from NPR is about this town called Hazleton, Pennsylvania. And this is a picture from 2017, a Hazleton resident, but it talks about this dramatic shift in demographics of Hazleton, a Rust Belt town where a lot of the jobs disappeared. And what happened was from 2000, in 2000, Hazleton was 93, I think, maybe 97% white. In 2016, it was 43% white. And that shift was largely due to a rise in numbers of Latinos who came to work in a new set of jobs that were available. And many of the whites who were then working there left. And it's an incredible story, including this image of this woman this is her house. Again, this is in Pennsylvania where she's flying a Confederate flag. And she says it's in order to remind Hazletonians who we are. I did mention this is Pennsylvania, right? Okay. It's a really thoughtful article, though, and with really clear evidence of this shifting status and what they call, I think thoughtfully in a good metaphor, altitude adjustment. Your status as dominant, as true, as real Hazletonians has changed. And interestingly, the influx of Latinos to this community has actually co-occurred and really been the source of increased economic prosperity in the region. So even with greater economic opportunity and more resources coming into the town, they're still incredibly fraught with really terrible tensions between the two communities in this small town. Okay? So we know from our work and many others that a salient future minority U.S., minority white United States, but also Europe, triggers multiple social identity threats. And if we know nothing else, social psychology knows that social identity threat engenders intergroup tension. And that's the moment we're in right now nationally, I'd like to argue, and certainly Hazleton's in, and many other small towns are also in. But I would argue nationally, we are at a crossroads. For many in our nation, including members of the White House staff, many elected officials, diversity is not consistent with democracy. They see diversity as something that's at odds with democracy, or at least something that threatens democracy. Okay? The very question of what it means to be American is at stake. At least it's now being contested. Consider, for example, this one, selected, of course, but not rare, example. This is the very conversation that's happening in Hazleton, where this gentleman says to Sean Hannity, in Arizona, a majority of the grade school children are now Hispanic. That means Arizona's future is as a Hispanic society. That means, in effect, the border has moved north. What it means to be American. Apparently, if that means not white, then it's not possible, right? That's not something that can be understood from a certain worldview, democracy or diversity. right? The current contestation of Confederate monuments that is now omnipresent, not just in the South, is another example of this, right? And when we've seen sort of the more horrific ways in which this has been played out, right? Again, the Charlottesville image. I invite you to consider also what happened in Tennessee, where Memphis, right, a predominantly black town, found a way to remove their monuments legally, despite the state having prohibitions of that sort of thing, against that sort of thing. And what happened was not, oh, you got us. The state actually defunded Memphis. $200,000 took away from their budget, predominantly black city, as a punishment for removing the Confederate monuments. Okay. Recent work from our lab has shown, again, quite convincingly, that status threat among white Americans of all regions of the country predict quite strongly support for keeping Confederate monuments in the US Capitol. Okay? Equally strongly for conservatives and for liberals. So I think it's time to have a real conversation about what diversity of our nation and its increasing diversity has to say about, or what implications it might have for people's understanding of America as a democracy, where people are equal under the law. And how can we move this sense that at least some have, that either we can be a democracy or be diverse, to a space where we can actually be diverse and be a democracy? And how do we get one another to buy into that idea? Okay. So, you know, I'm Debbie Downer a little bit too much. So I'm gonna try to offer a few, I can't really call them solutions because I don't have any, but prescriptions for one, how we can, you know, maybe think about this issue and this problem a little bit better. And because I'm, you know, I'm funny, but not that funny. I'm gonna use the assistance of the great Hari Kondabolu, with a clip of his stand-up. Do you guys know Hari? Very funny. Jeff, can we get the clip? Who talks about this?
I'm not the one who's obsessed. This country is obsessed. I hear about the year 2042 all the time on the news. 2042, for those of you who don't know, 2042 apparently, according to census figures, is the year that white people will be the minority in this country, right? White people will be 49% in 2042. And I don't know if there are people in this audience that are upset by this, but don't worry, white people. You were the minority when you came to this country. Things seem to have worked out for you, right? But here's the bigger point. Here's the more important point. 49% doesn't make you the minority, right? That's not how math works, right? 49% white only makes you the minority if you think the other 51% are exactly the same. That only works if you think, well, it's 49% white people and 51% you people. That's the only way. Because that 51%, my friends, is not a united front, okay? Just ask a black guy and a Korean guy what happens when the black guy walks into the Korean guy's store, okay? I bet you that interaction isn't pleasant. I bet you that interaction isn't like, hey, teammate, how's it going, teammate? Pretty good, am I right? 2042. That's not what's happening.
Good. So, you know, before you get into research, make sure there's good comedy that goes with it. But, you know, he makes some really great points, right? And with a laugh. One, majority, minority as an idea never made any sense. It still makes no sense, right? I mean, what are we talking about? And why are we setting this sort of white and not white boundary so rigidly? What does that say about the protection of whiteness? And what is that about? White Americans will continue to be the largest racial ethnic group in the United States, even when they slip down to 49%. And so we need to think about why this boundary seems so precious. And one, you know, what are we doing with it? right? And why are we, more importantly, why are we communicating this information this way? And as a side note, I should say, in multiple conversations with the guys from the Census Race Beat, they stopped using this language. So, good on them. Of course, now the horse is out of the barn, one of those sayings. Cat is out of the bag, somebody's out of something, and the media has gone with it, right? So it's hard to bring it back, but that was a choice that I think they regret now, using that language. For the reasons that we've talked about its effects, but also this other reason. One that demographers like Rich Alba have shown and repeatedly demonstrated, and that it's actually, even this so-called 49% is unlikely to happen. Because race, whiteness, but all racial categories, as I suggested earlier, are made up, right? It's a choice that we have about who is considered white. The groups of people that we now consider white were not always considered white. Some groups get to become white and some groups get taken out. Ask any person of Middle Eastern descent or Arab descent after 9/11 how white they feel now, right? It changes. And the government has a big say in who identifies as white. And in a growing multiracial set of population, right? Kids, mixed race kids, also have a say in their own racial identity. And the construction of whiteness that leads to the projections of 2042 and now 2050 are a very rigid one. It's the census saying, if you checked off white and anything else on your census form, you are not white. That's how they come up with that number. If they use if you check off white and anything else, you're still white, you're actually in the 2070s, and really they don't even count up that far, right? So that was always a choice. And it's one, again, that is just some guys in a room with computers who decided that. But it has real implications. Okay, so we need to think carefully about really how do we think about race anyway? How are we constructing race? And that we're constructing race. There's nothing natural about it. And so there's nothing natural about its increase or its decline. Okay? It's also important to remember, again, we did that assuage threat condition just to try to understand the mechanism that was at play. But it turns out people don't know that white Americans still are pretty much in control of everything, right? So it might not be a bad idea to actually communicate the actual relative status of different racial groups and, more importantly, the continuing presence of inequality, especially racial inequality, on any number of outcomes in the country. Because I hate to tell you, but there is no need to be concerned about status relations changing. Okay? So another theory of what to do is to wait it out. This is, I call the California theory. It turns out, the demographics of the nation are shifting, right? This is where we expect it to become so-called majority-minority United States. But California, right, and Trump happened about here, right? Right, and more than Trump, this new resurgent white nationalist moment. But California already did this, right? California became and has been so-called majority-minority for some time now. It happened in 2000. And if those of you from California or you remember, right before that, a whole bunch of policies that really were designed to protect whiteness and a white California. In fact, some of them were called something like California First or something quite similar, were put into place in order to maintain the status and standing, the cultural and material dominance of white Californians. Okay, that happened, right? Some of them are being undone now. Some of them are still with us. But so we can think about California sort of been through this, so maybe we'll all become California. And in fact, that is the theory of a really lovely economist and demographer, Manuel Pastor at USC, who talks about California as the model of where America is going in this more racially diverse nation. It's a hopeful story. Some others have a different story. That we won't become California as our diversity increases, but we'll become Mississippi, quite diverse, at least large numbers of Black Americans, a state that's very large, population of Black Americans, with enormous economic, health, I mean, you name it, markers of inequality. So it's possible. And I think really it's up to us as Americans who are committed to the democratic project that is the United States of America to think about how can we imagine a future that includes so many different types of people, this level of racial diversity, but also religious diversity, language diversity, just a broad swath of different people while still maintaining a commitment to the democratic project that is supposed to be the United States. It's up to us, okay? So before I close, I want to do a little bit of cleanup. It's been a long talk. You might have zoned out. But I want to just, make sure we have some clarity about what I've said versus what you may have thought you heard me say. Okay. So you might have thought you heard me say that conservatives don't like racial minorities, or something like political conservatives feel threatened by increasing diversity. No, I did not say that. In fact, across all of our studies, especially those for conservatism, the effects are typically larger for moderates and liberals. Again, they have room to move, but we've observed them in college students, right? So-called liberal college students, right? And again, we observe them in racial minorities. Okay, this is not something about conservatives. It's not even something about white people per se. We also see it, again, not us, but other work in Europe, in the UK, in Italy, in Canada, right? It's a psychology, it's old psychology, in fact, of group position that we need to be reminded of and think about its relevance for this moment, okay? You might have also thought you heard me say that being politically conservative is bad. I didn't say that. But let me be clear. The current positions of the political right are largely inconsistent with government intervention to ensure minority rights and participation and the increase of racial and other forms of equality. Ones that we know are effective. Voting rights, voluntary desegregation, anti-discrimination laws, immigration policies, citizenship policies, right? So those current positions of the current right are inconsistent with obviously progressive racial egalitarian advocacy. That is true. But this, again, we see a shift towards conservatism on a range of policies. And so if you happen to favor a conservative tax policy, for instance, there you go. Okay? The effects are quite broad. So back to the beginning. It is the case that the United States is becoming more demographically diverse, and this has been happening county by county, state by state for some time now, and the rest of the country is sort of catching up and realizing it. And I invite you to consider the possibility that indeed this is a good. It certainly is happening, but it also is valuable. It's part of what makes the United States special and vibrant and different from any number of other countries in which you are not born a citizen. Okay? I also invite you to consider the possibility that this is incredibly challenging. And it's challenged at every turn through policy, for instance. Not just nationally, not just with governments, not just state, but even in the context in which we occupy, most of us, universities. Okay? So it's tough. It is tough. And nationally, we've never seen a country do this well, right? There is no such thing as a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious democracy that's vibrant and healthy and prospering. That does not exist. But we have an opportunity to make that so in this country. We have an opportunity. I'd also like to suggest, just a little nod to us. Us. Psychological science underlies much of the racial and political dynamics of our current moment in this increasingly diverse nation. So we need to be at the table. We need to be in communication with folks, political scientists, economists, sociologists, demographers, and policy folks to really help us usher our nation in this more egalitarian direction where we're both a democracy and diverse, as opposed to the other possibility. Okay? And with that, I really want to thank the members of my lab, the students, and of course, all the people who funded this work. I invite you to check us out at this website or follow me in my rantings on Twitter. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that tremendous presentation. I have 2 announcements to make. The science continues tomorrow. And tomorrow we have Symposium Sunday. You know, with a talk like that, you sort of feels like a finale. But, but we have great symposia coming up tomorrow by some of the field's most distinguished scientists. So please stay with us until tomorrow and come to those symposia, you know, Sunday slots. You are in them sometimes. And now it's time to celebrate APS's 30th anniversary. And we'll do it with music, food, and friends. And you will show how to party. Okay? So let's head out at the back of this room to Continental 1 and 3. Have a great time and come back tomorrow.